The room went silent the moment the data came up on screen. For 3,300 years, the golden death mask of Tutankhamun has been the most recognized object on the planet. 22 pounds of solid gold that millions of people line up inside the Grand Egyptian Museum to see. Then, a team of physicists aimed a quantum imaging scanner at it, expecting to confirm what every textbook already said. And instead, the readout showed something that made every Egyptologist in the room go pale. Here's the thing. What they found hasn't been published. It's being fought over right now by people whose entire reputations depend on the old story staying true. But the scan exists. And once you understand what's buried under that gold, you will never look at that face the same way again. I'm Ambrose Wild, and this is one of those stories where the evidence was sitting in plain sight for 100 years, and we just didn't have the machine that could see it. Let me take you into the museum on the night it happened, because the setup matters. The scan ran after closing, when the halls were empty and the temperature was stable, which is exactly the condition delicate gold artifacts need. The team wasn't hunting for a conspiracy. Officially, this was a calibration run, a way to prove their new equipment could read ancient alloy without touching it. For the first few hours, everything the scanner returned lined up perfectly with what historians already believed. Then the beam settled over the cartouche, the small oval that holds the pharaoh's name in carved hieroglyphs, and the data stopped making sense. Beneath the visible carving, the scanner was picking up a second pattern, a ghost. Atoms displaced in a way that only happens when metal has been beaten down, scraped, and recarved. Someone had erased something here, and then written over it. To understand why that single readout is so devastating, you have to go back to the day the mask entered the modern world. And you have to understand how completely it fooled everyone. November 1922. The archaeologist Howard Carter chips a small opening into a sealed doorway in the Valley of the Kings and lifts a candle to the gap. When his sponsor asks whether he can see anything, Carter answers that he can see wonderful things. Understand the context of that moment. Carter had spent the better part of a decade searching this exact stretch of desert, funded by a wealthy patron who had nearly cut him off the season before. Almost every other royal tomb in the valley had already been found, and every one of them had been emptied by robbers in antiquity. The expectation was another looted hollow chamber. Instead, behind that doorway, Carter found a burial that grave robbers had barely touched, the closest thing to an intact royal tomb anyone had ever walked into. Inside was a hoard that redefined what we thought ancient Egypt was capable of. Gilded chariots dismantled and stacked against the walls, a throne sheathed in gold, alabaster jars, walking sticks, board games, carved statues caught mid-stride, and food and wine sealed for a journey into the afterlife. It took Carter and his team nearly a decade to catalogue it all. But nested inside 3 coffins, one within the next like a set of Russian dolls, with the innermost coffin cut from over 240 pounds of solid gold, lay the object that would outshine everything else ever pulled from Egyptian soil. The golden face. Sit with the physical reality of this thing for a second. It weighs more than a bowling ball. 22 pounds of gold inlaid with lapis lazuli and turquoise, with eyes cut from obsidian and quartz that seem to track you as you move past the display case. To the Egyptians, gold was not wealth. They believed it was the actual flesh of the gods, a metal that never tarnished and never decayed, which made it the perfect material for eternity. Silver they associated with the bones of the gods, but gold was divine skin, and putting a mask of it over a dead king's face was meant to transform him, physically, into something like a god himself. So this mask was not jewellery, it was a piece of sacred machinery. The Egyptians believed a person had several parts to their soul, and one of them, the ka, had to return to the body each night to survive. If the body was destroyed or unrecognisable, the ka had nowhere to land, and the person died a second and final death, the one they truly feared. The mask was insurance against that. It gave the soul a permanent, unmistakable face to come home to. On the back, a spell from the Book of the Dead was carved as protection, naming the parts of the face one by one and binding each to a protective god. For 100 years, the world treated this as the flawless masterpiece of the ancient world, made specifically for a king who died at 19. But almost from the start, specialists kept noticing details that refused to fit. And the strange part is that none of these clues were hidden. They were on the surface the entire time. We just didn't want to follow where they led. The first crack is a matter of arithmetic, and it's brutal. Egyptian religious law fixed the mummification process at exactly 70 days. Not 68, not 72, 70. Now think about what that window actually demands. In 70 days, workers had to cut an entire royal tomb out of solid limestone, build 3 nested coffins, gather thousands of grave goods, and produce a 22-pound solid gold mask covered in microscopic detail, inlaid with cut gemstones, and inscribed with hand-carved spells. For a death that nobody saw coming, because Tutankhamun appears to have died suddenly, most likely from an infection after a badly broken leg. And the tomb itself gives the game away. It is small, embarrassingly small next to the tombs of other pharaohs, more the size of a high official's burial than a king's. Some of the wall paintings look unfinished, as though the artists were pulled off the job before they could complete them. There is a detail here most people miss. The paint on those walls developed strange brown spots, and analysis showed they were microbial, the residue of living organisms. In plain terms, the tomb was sealed while the paint was still wet, which is exactly what you would expect if the burial was rushed and nobody had time to let the chamber dry. Every other clue points to panic, and so does the mould on the walls. The stone sarcophagus is chipped at the corners, the kind of damage you get when panicked workers are forcing an object into a space it doesn't quite fit. And when researchers looked closely at the other treasures, many of them clearly weren't made for this king at all. Statues with faces that don't resemble him, jewellery sized for a woman, canoptic coffinets, the little containers that held the king's preserved organs, that still carry a different royal name underneath the recarving, a name linked to the Amarna period Nefertiti belonged to. Even the second coffin has features that scholars have argued were originally built for someone else. The pattern is everywhere in this tomb. Objects made for one person hastily reassigned to another. So they went back to the mask and actually studied it. The ears are pierced. In ancient Egyptian convention, that is a serious problem, because pierced ears belong to children and to women. A grown male pharaoh on the sacred object meant to carry his soul into eternity would not be shown wearing earrings. It broke the rules of kingship. The face reads as delicate, almost feminine, and the gold across the face carries a faintly different colour from the headdress behind it, a subtle reddish shift that shouldn't exist if the whole piece had been cast at once from a single pore. Put those together, and a disturbing possibility takes shape. What if, when the boy king died with no warning, there was no mask ready for him? What if the priests, trapped against that unmoving 70-day deadline, took a finished mask from someone else's burial, altered it just enough to pass, and sent the king into the afterlife wearing a face that was never his? Which forces the question that has haunted Egyptology for decades. If the mask wasn't made for Tutankhamun, whose face was it? The most likely answer points straight at the most dangerous woman in Egyptian history. Her name was Nefertiti. You already know the face, the painted bust with the long neck and the faint, knowing smile. One of the most reproduced images to survive from the ancient world. She was the boy king's stepmother, wife of the heretic pharaoh Akhenaten, the ruler who tried to erase Egypt's gods and replace them with a single sun disk called the Aten. That was not a small religious tweak. Akhenaten shut the temples, redirected the wealth of the priesthood, and moved the entire capital to a brand new city built from nothing in the desert. It was one of the most radical acts in Egyptian history, and when he died, the establishment he had attacked wanted every trace of it gone. That is the crucial background, because after Akhenaten died, Nefertiti may have done something almost no woman in Egyptian history did. She may have taken the throne herself and ruled as pharaoh under a new royal name. And then she vanished. Her tomb has never been confirmed. Her mummy has never been positively identified. When the old religion came roaring back, the priests systematically chiseled Akhenaten and his family out of the monuments, smashed their statues, and struck their names from the king lists so thoroughly that later Egyptians didn't even know they had existed. A woman who may have ruled an empire simply drops out of the record, and we know for a fact that erasing her was official policy. So the question isn't whether someone wanted her gone. We know they did. The question is what they did with what she left behind. Here is what unsettled researchers. If Nefertiti died before Tutankhamun, and if she had a royal burial mask already prepared for her own death, and if the boy king then died suddenly with nothing ready, every anomaly resolves at once. The pierced ears fit. The feminine features fit. The rushed alterations fit. The math is clean. The problem was that proving it meant damaging one of the most precious objects on Earth to look beneath the surface, and nobody was ever going to allow that. So for decades, the Nefertiti theory stayed exactly that, a theory. Whispered at conferences, waved away by the establishment, impossible to test. Then, in 2014, someone broke the mask. And that accident is what eventually cracked the whole thing open. If you're finding this as strange as I did the first time I read the scan notes, subscribe, because I dig into the ancient mysteries that turned out to be hiding something every single week. The 2014 incident made headlines around the world. During a cleaning at the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, a worker knocked the mask and the long braided beard, a sacred emblem of divine kingship, snapped clean off. What happened next was almost worse than the break. Instead of calling in trained conservators, museum staff panicked and reached for the fastest fix available: a strong commercial epoxy, the kind of glue meant for repairs around the house. They forced the beard back on and smeared the adhesive so carelessly that a visible film of it hardened onto the golden chin. An object that had survived 33 centuries had been damaged with hardware store glue, and then damaged again by the repair. The scandal forced Egypt to bring in an international conservation team led by a German specialist, Christian Ekman. His job was to remove the epoxy and reattach the beard properly. But Ekman understood he had a rare opportunity in his hands. Before touching the beard, he could scan the mask using X-ray fluorescence, a technique that reads the chemical composition of metal. His logic was sound. If a face had been cut from one mask and joined onto another, the scan should catch it. Different gold blends, solder seams, the chemical fingerprints of alteration. His team spent months mapping the surface, and the results looked decisive. The gold in the face matched the gold in the headdress. The hieroglyphs spelling out the king's name showed no obvious sign of being carved over an earlier inscription. And the fragile glass inlays around the eyes were perfectly intact, which mattered enormously, because soldering a new face on from the front would have needed heat that cracks glass instantly. To most of the field, that settled it. The Nefertiti theory was dead. The mask was the king's, start to finish. Ekman's team lifted the epoxy and reattached the beard with beeswax, the same adhesive the original craftsman would have used, and the mask went back on display. The textbooks stayed as they were. But a small group of scientists never accepted that verdict, and their objection was technical, not emotional. X-ray fluorescence, they argued, has a blind spot the size of a truck. X-rays read density and chemistry. They can find a solder joint made from a different alloy. But what if the ancient goldsmiths were better than that? What if they plugged the pierced ear holes with gold drawn from the exact same batch so the chemistry matched perfectly? What if they hammered the old name completely flat before carving the new one? What if the new face was pressure joined so precisely that the seam was only a few atoms thick? X-rays would sail right past all of it, because X-rays cannot read the history of a metal. They cannot tell gold that was poured once from gold that was later reheated, beaten, and reworked. To see that, you need a machine that reads the thermal memory stored in the atoms themselves. And by 2024, that machine existed. Which brings us back to that silent room in the Grand Egyptian Museum, and the physicist running the scan, Helena Voss, a materials specialist whose field is quantum resonance imaging, a technology so new it barely operates outside a handful of laboratories. Here is the idea behind it in plain language, because the idea is the whole story. When you work a piece of metal, when you heat it, hammer it, or bend it, you don't just change its shape. You change the arrangement of the atoms inside it, and you leave a strain pattern locked in the crystal structure. That pattern doesn't go away. It sits there, frozen, for as long as the metal exists. A quantum resonance scanner is built to read those strain patterns, which means it can effectively reconstruct what was done to a piece of metal, and in what order, thousands of years after the fact. It doesn't see the surface, it reads the biography of the material. Gold that was poured once and left alone tells one story. Gold that was heated, beaten flat and recarved tells a completely different one, and the scanner can tell them apart. Her team had secured rare permission from Egypt's Antiquities Authority to run a non-invasive scan. Nobody expected to overturn a century of consensus. They expected to confirm it. When the beam settled on the cartouche and the ghost pattern appeared, Voss did what any careful scientist does. She assumed the machine was wrong. She had the technician run it again. Same result. She ordered a recalibration. Same result. An Egyptologist from Cairo University who was present that night, Ahmed Hassan, later described the silence in the room as total. The scanner was showing plainly that the gold under the king's name had been hammered, scraped and recarved in a way that appeared nowhere else on the entire mask. Then the team ran a full structural pass, and it dismantled the consensus piece by piece. First, the ears. Under X-ray, they were solid gold. Under the quantum scan, they were something else. Two clean cylindrical plugs, rods of gold in a matching alloy, driven into the original piercings and then polished until the seams disappeared from every instrument built before 2024. The ears had been pierced. Someone filled the holes. Whoever this mask was made for wore earrings. Then the face. The imager detected what Voss called thermal ghosting, a faint molecular halo running the entire perimeter where the face meets the headdress. That halo is a signature. It means the gold along that exact outline was once heated to a different temperature than the metal around it. The craftsman hadn't soldered from the front, which would have shattered the eye inlays. They had attached the new face from behind, using high-pressure heat that left the visible surface flawless, invisible to X-rays. But the atoms remembered. The face had been cut out and replaced. And then Hassan asked the question that turned a strange scan into history. Could the machine reconstruct what had been erased? Voss said yes. By mapping the microscopic scars of the original hammering, the faint impressions of the first inscription still frozen in the metal, the computer could rebuild the name that used to be there. She started the program. The reconstruction ran for 11 minutes. Then, one symbol at a time, the original hieroglyphs assembled on the screen. It was not Tutankhamun. The name was Neferu Aten, the throne name that historians have long believed Nefertiti used when she ruled Egypt as pharaoh. So here is the sequence the scan lets us finally reconstruct. And it starts with a political crisis, not an artistic one. When the boy king died with no warning, Egypt had a problem far bigger than a missing mask. He died without an heir. His two known children were both stillborn, and they were buried in the tomb with him, two tiny mummified daughters in miniature coffins. That meant the throne was suddenly, dangerously empty. And in ancient Egypt, an empty throne was an invitation to chaos. Whoever controlled the burial controlled the succession, because in Egyptian tradition, the man who buried the old king was recognized as the new one. That man was I, an aging courtier who had served the family for years. And the walls of the tomb show him doing exactly that, performing the sacred burial ritual over the young king, dressed in the leopard skin of the officiating priest, a scene almost never shown for a successor who wasn't the dead king's son. I wasn't just mourning, he was staking his claim. And here is where the missing mask fits. There is strong evidence that the grander tomb originally being prepared for the young king was taken over by I for his own eventual burial, while the boy was crammed into the small, unfinished chamber Carter later found. So the successor took the tomb. The priests were left with a rushed burial, a wet-painted chamber, and no royal mask. They were cornered. 70 days, no mask, no time to build one from raw gold, no room to fail. Because a king buried without a proper face could not become a god. And a dead king who never reached the afterlife was a catastrophe for everyone who served him. So they went to the burial that did have a finished royal mask ready, the burial of Nefertiti. They took her mask and got to work. They plugged her pierced ears with gold from a matching batch, hammering until no seam survived. They commissioned a new face carrying the boy king's features. They cut Nefertiti's face out and joined the new one from behind, with a technique so far ahead of its time that the join stayed invisible for 3,000 years. They beat her royal name flat and carved his over it. They buried their king wearing a stolen face, and they buried the truth with him. The mask sits today in the Grand Egyptian Museum, and millions of visitors stand in front of it every year, believing they are looking at Tutankhamun. Beneath that golden surface lies the ghost of a queen who was erased from history, hidden for 3,300 years, and exposed by a machine that reads the memory of atoms. None of this is officially published yet. It is still being verified, still being argued over behind closed doors, and there are careers riding on it staying unproven. But the data is out in the open now, and it raises questions that don't have comfortable answers. If the mask was taken from Nefertiti's burial, what else in that famous treasure hoard was grabbed from other tombs in the same desperate scramble? How many of the boy king's legendary artifacts were never his? And the question I can't stop turning over, if they stole her mask to bury him, then what did they put on her face when they buried the queen? That's the one I want to chase next. And if you want to come with me, stick around, because I go looking for the answer to exactly these kinds of buried questions every week. I'm Ambrose Wild. I'll see you in the next one.